Two nations, combined GDP of $46 trillion, and they cannot spend 5 years without edging toward war. By the end of this video, you will understand something that career diplomats rarely admit publicly, that the conflict between the United States and China is not a political problem waiting for the right leader to solve it. It is not about tariffs, not about Taiwan, and not about competing military budgets. It is about the psychology of power itself. Two nations that have each convinced their own citizens they are the rightful center of the world order cannot share that stage. History tells us what happens next. Psychologists have a name for the mechanism driving it. And the most chilling part? Both governments know it. The decisions being made right now in Washington and Beijing are not accidents. They are the predictable output of a psychological trap that has swallowed every great power rivalry in recorded history. From Athens and Sparta to Britain and Germany. Stay with this video. The evidence is overwhelming and it changes everything. To understand where we are, you need to understand where this started. After World War II, the United States emerged as the undisputed global hegemon. Its factories had powered the Allied victory. Its dollar became the world's reserve currency. Its military stretched from Germany to Japan. American leaders genuinely believed, not as propaganda, but as deep conviction, that the entire world was on an inevitable path toward liberal democracy and free markets. This was not arrogance. It was faith. A faith reinforced by the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, which seemed to prove the thesis entirely. Political scientist Francis Fukuyama famously declared the end of history, the idea that liberal capitalism had permanently won the ideological battle for humanity. The United States entered the 21st century as the most powerful nation in human history. It had a plan for China, and that plan was about to collide with something it had completely failed to understand. China's story runs on a completely different psychological frequency. For most of recorded history, China was the world's largest economy. In 1820, it accounted for roughly 33% of global GDP, more than the entire continent of Europe combined. The Chinese do not have a word for becoming a superpower. They have a word for returning to one. That distinction matters enormously. When Chinese leaders talk about the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, they are not describing an ambition. They are describing a correction, a righting of a historical wrong. The century of humiliation, the period from 1839 to 1949 when China was carved up by foreign powers, sits in the national consciousness like a wound that never fully closed. Every policy decision, every military expansion, every trade dispute carries the ghost of that humiliation. China is not trying to conquer the world. It is trying to ensure the world can never humiliate it again. Now look at this timeline and let it sink in. In 1980, China's GDP was approximately $300 billion. The United States sat at $2.8 trillion. China was not a rival. It was a market waiting to be opened. American corporations and policymakers made a calculated bet. Bring China into the global economic system, let it grow wealthy, and it would inevitably liberalize politically. This was the theory of economic interdependence. And for 2 decades, it seemed to be working. China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. Its middle class exploded. Foreign investment poured in. American companies from Apple to Walmart built their entire supply chains around Chinese manufacturing. The relationship looked like a partnership. Economists called it chimerica, a fusion economy so intertwined that conflict would be mutually suicidal. The psychological trap had already been set. Neither side could see it yet. The first psychological concept you need to understand is called the Thucydides Trap. Harvard political scientist Graham Allison named it after the ancient Greek historian who documented the war between Athens and Sparta. The principle is brutal in its simplicity. When a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, the result is almost always war. Allison examined 16 historical cases over the past 500 years in which a rising power challenged the dominant one. 12 of those 16 cases ended in war. The exceptions are rare and required extraordinary deliberate effort to avoid catastrophe. The United States and China are now the most consequential instance of this dynamic in modern history. But here is what makes this particular case psychologically unique, and what most analysts miss entirely. The Thucydides Trap is not primarily a geopolitical problem. At its core, it is a problem of identity. Both nations have built their entire self-concept around being number one. Consider the psychological profile of the United States as a nation. America was founded on a founding myth, the belief that it is not merely a country, but an idea. That idea is universalist. Freedom, democracy, and individual rights are not American values, they are human values, and America is their guardian. This belief shapes everything from school curricula to foreign policy doctrine to how American presidents write their speeches. Political psychologists describe this as a form of collective narcissism, not in a pejorative sense, but in the technical sense. The nation derives its identity from a perceived exceptional status that must be maintained and recognized by others. Research by psychologist Agnieszka Golec de Zavala at Goldsmiths University has shown that collective narcissism at the national level is a reliable predictor of hostile foreign policy attitudes toward nations perceived as threatening that status. The United States does not merely want to be powerful, it needs to be seen as righteous in its power. China's national identity is built on an equally powerful but structurally opposite foundation. Where America's identity is universalist, come join us, China's identity is civilizational and exclusive. The concept of Zhongguo, the Middle Kingdom, is not metaphor. For millennia, it described a genuine worldview in which China was literally the center of civilized existence, with tributary states arranged around it in concentric circles of decreasing importance. Modern Chinese nationalism has fused this ancient self-concept with the Communist Party's Marxist legitimacy narrative. The party does not merely govern China. According to its own official ideology, it is the culmination of Chinese history, the force that ended the century of humiliation and restored China's rightful place. This creates a psychological dynamic that researcher Suisheng Zhao at the University of Denver identifies as pragmatic nationalism, an ideology that is flexible on tactics but absolutely rigid on the core premise that China's dignity and sovereignty are non-negotiable. Challenge either, and you activate a response that feels existential rather than political. Here are the numbers that tell you exactly why psychology matters more than diplomacy in this rivalry. The United States currently spends approximately $858 billion per year on its military, more than the next 10 nations combined. China spends approximately $224 billion. But look at the trend lines, not the snapshots. In 2000, China's military budget was roughly $30 billion. In 24 years, it has increased by more than 600%. At the same time, China now manufactures more naval vessels per year than the United States has in its entire active fleet. These are not the actions of a nation seeking peaceful coexistence, nor are they the actions of a rogue aggressor. They are the perfectly rational decisions of a nation that has internalized one lesson from its own history with devastating clarity. Military weakness invites humiliation. The asymmetry between budgets blinds Western analysts to the asymmetry in motivation. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. Because the conflict isn't only about guns and money. It runs through the invisible architecture of the internet, universities, corporations, and even scientific journals. The United States and China are engaged in what intelligence communities call the most consequential technology competition in history. Semiconductors, the chips that run everything from your smartphone to a nuclear warhead, have become the new oil. In 2022, the Biden administration signed the CHIPS Act and imposed sweeping restrictions on exporting advanced semiconductor technology to China. Beijing described this as an act of technological war. And they were not entirely wrong. When the United States cut off ASML, the Dutch company that makes the only machines capable of manufacturing the most advanced chips, from selling to Chinese firms, it was a deliberate act of strategic strangulation. Taiwan's TSMC, which manufactures the majority of the world's most advanced chips, sits directly in the crosshairs of this conflict. The technology war is already happening. Most people just cannot see it. Now, let us bring in the geography, because the South China Sea is the single most dangerous square kilometer of water on Earth right now. China claims approximately 90% of this critical shipping lane through what it calls the 9-Line, a territorial claim that has no basis in international law. The Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague ruled in 2016 that the 9-dash line was illegal. China's official response was to declare that ruling null and void and to accelerate construction of artificial islands equipped with military installations. Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan all have overlapping claims. The United States conducts freedom of navigation operations through these waters, operations that China describes as deliberate provocations. The Philippines, a treaty ally of the United States, has seen escalating confrontations with Chinese Coast Guard vessels as recently as 2024. This is not a frozen conflict. It is an active pressure cooker with American and Chinese naval assets operating within visual range of each other on a near-weekly basis. One of the most important psychological concepts for understanding this rivalry is what social psychologists call the security dilemma. It was formally described by international relations theorist John Herds in 1950, but its logic is ancient and devastating. The principle goes like this. When Nation A increases its military capabilities, even for purely defensive reasons, Nation B perceives a threat and increases its own capabilities in response. Nation A, observing that response, increases further. Both nations are now in an arms race that neither originally wanted, driven entirely by rational responses to the other's rational actions. Neither side is the aggressor. Both sides are. Apply this to the United States and China, and the pattern becomes unmistakable. Every American freedom of navigation operation in the South China Sea that is framed in Washington as upholding international law is experienced in Beijing as encirclement. Every Chinese island fortification that Beijing frames as sovereign territory defense is experienced in Washington as expansionist aggression. Both perceptions are sincere. That is what makes the security dilemma so psychologically lethal. There is a real story buried inside this rivalry that perfectly illustrates the psychological gap. In 2015, Chinese President Xi Jinping stood in the Rose Garden of the White House next to Barack Obama and made a specific commitment. China would not militarize the artificial islands it was building in the South China Sea. He said it clearly and on the record. Within months, satellite imagery confirmed the construction of runways, hangars, radar installations, and surface-to-air missile systems on those same islands. American officials were furious. Chinese officials were, by all accounts, unmoved. How can a head of state make a commitment face-to-face with the leader of the most powerful country on Earth and then break it immediately and openly? The answer lies in a concept called asymmetric payoffs, documented by researchers studying U.S.-China policy communication. In the Chinese political system, publicly backing down to American pressure is an existential threat to Communist Party legitimacy. Breaking a commitment to Washington carries essentially no domestic cost. This asymmetry is not dishonesty, it is a fundamentally different operating system. The trade war that exploded in 2018 under President Donald Trump was not an aberration. It was the moment the underlying psychology finally surfaced publicly. The United States accused China of intellectual property theft on a systemic state-sponsored scale. The Office of the United States Trade Representative estimated annual losses to American companies of between $200 and $600 billion every single year. China's official response combined denial with counter-accusation, pointing to American economic imperialism and double standards. But here is what the psychological research on this kind of conflict tells us. When two parties each believe they are the victim of the other's aggression, compromise becomes psychologically impossible. Each concession feels not like diplomacy, but like surrender. Research by social psychologist Jonathan Haidt on moral outrage shows that when a conflict becomes moralized, when it stops being about interests and starts being about right and wrong, the probability of rational negotiated settlement drops to near zero. Both Washington and Beijing had fully moralized this conflict by 2018. Every subsequent interaction would be filtered through that lens. There is a school of thought, and it deserves a serious hearing, that says this rivalry is overblown. That economic interdependence is so deep that real war is effectively impossible. That rational leaders on both sides understand the catastrophic consequences of open conflict and will always pull back from the brink. The argument has genuine merit. The United States and China are each other's largest trading partners in many categories. In 23, bilateral trade between the two nations still exceeded $575 billion, despite years of deliberate decoupling efforts. Millions of American jobs depend directly or indirectly on Chinese manufacturing. Trillions of dollars in American debt are held by China. The argument for inevitable restraint says, follow the money. No rational actor destroys the system that enriches both sides. But this argument has a fatal flaw. And understanding that flaw is the key to understanding why this rivalry is unlike any that came before it. Rationality assumes both sides share the same definition of what they stand to lose. They do not. The myth that economic ties prevent war has a name in history: the Norman Angell fallacy. In 1910, British economist Norman Angell published a book called The Great Illusion, arguing that European economies were so intertwined that a major war had become economically irrational and therefore impossible. The book became a bestseller. It was cited by diplomats and politicians across Europe as evidence that the age of great power war was over. 4 years later, the most destructive war in human history to that point, World War I, killed 20 million people. The economies that were supposedly too integrated to fight did not merely fight. They fought with industrial efficiency, specifically because of their economic integration. They knew exactly how to strangle each other's supply chains. Economic interdependence does not prevent war. History shows it can actually shape how a war is fought. The United States and China have both read their history. Each is already building the tools to weaponize the other's economic dependencies when the moment comes. What you are about to hear in the next 60 seconds is the part most experts publicly avoid, because it makes the situation sound genuinely unsolvable. Here it is. The United States and China do not merely have conflicting interests. They have mutually exclusive identities. The United States has constructed a world order, the rules-based international order it calls it, in which American values are embedded as universal norms. Human rights, freedom of the press, democratic governance, individual liberty. These are not presented as American preferences. They are presented as objective moral standards that all legitimate governments must meet. China's entire system of governance fails every single one of those standards. This means that as long as the current Chinese system exists, it is an implicit refutation of the American identity claim. America cannot fully accept China as a legitimate great power without undermining its own foundational narrative. And China knows this. This is not a policy disagreement. This is an ontological conflict, a clash between two incompatible answers to the question of what makes a nation legitimate. This is the moment in the analysis that most commentators flinch away from. The research on U.S.-China relations cited by the Council on Foreign Relations describes a conviction strengthened by the collapse of the Soviet Union, an American belief that economic openness would lead China toward political liberalization. That conviction was not propaganda. It was deeply, sincerely held by some of the most experienced diplomats and China scholars in Washington. And it was catastrophically wrong. What actually happened is that China absorbed every benefit of integration with the global economic system: technology transfer, capital, markets, expertise, while the Communist Party tightened its grip on political power rather than loosening it. Under Xi Jinping, who took power in 2012, China's domestic political environment became dramatically more authoritarian, not less. The disappearance of legal scholars, the detention of over 1 million Uyghurs in Xinjiang, the erasure of Hong Kong's autonomy, these are not deviations from a reform path. They are the path. Washington had been operating on a false model of China for 30 years. The revelation of that error produced not a course correction, but a collective trauma. Taiwan is the single most dangerous variable in the entire equation, and understanding why requires understanding the psychology of red lines. For the Chinese Communist Party, Taiwan's independence is not a foreign policy preference. It is an existential threat. The party's legitimacy rests on the narrative of national reunification and the end of the century of humiliation. A permanently independent Taiwan, especially one defended by American military power, is a living daily reminder that the humiliation is not over. It is the party's greatest unresolved wound. For the United States, Taiwan represents something equally psychological in its weight. Abandoning Taiwan would signal to every American ally, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, NATO members, that American security guarantees are conditional. The credibility of American power globally rests on the demonstration that it will protect its partners. Political psychologists call this the audience cost problem, the domestic and international reputational damage of backing down. Both Xi Jinping and any American president face audience costs so severe on the Taiwan question that rational de-escalation may genuinely be impossible when the moment of crisis arrives. Now, here is the revelation that changes everything, and it comes not from geopolitics, but from cognitive science. In 2023, researchers at Harvard's Kennedy School published an analysis of decision-making patterns in U.S.-China diplomatic communications over the previous 2 decades. What they found was striking. Both sides consistently interpreted the other's signals through what psychologists call the fundamental attribution error, the cognitive bias that causes people to explain their own behavior by circumstances, but explain the opponent's identical behavior by character. When American forces conduct a freedom of navigation exercise, Washington sees routine law enforcement. When Chinese forces conduct an equivalent operation near Guam, Washington sees aggression. Chinese decision-makers do precisely the same thing in reverse. The fundamental attribution error means that every escalatory action by the other side confirms the existing threat narrative, and every de-escalatory gesture is discounted as tactical rather than genuine. It is not that leaders on both sides are irrational. The tragedy is that they are perfectly rational, while using cognitive architecture that makes conflict the inevitable output. There are 3 specific flashpoints where the fundamental attribution error is most dangerous, and they are active right now. First, the Taiwan Strait, where Chinese military aircraft violations of Taiwan's air defense identification zone reached nearly 2,000 recorded incursions in 2023. Each one is framed by Beijing as a legitimate sovereignty assertion. Each one is experienced in Taipei and Washington as a rehearsal for invasion. Second, the Himalayan border between India and China, where skirmishes in Galwan Valley in 2020 killed 20 Indian soldiers and an unconfirmed number of Chinese troops, the first deadly border clash between nuclear-armed nations in the modern era. Third, the Arctic, where both nations are now competing for shipping routes and resource rights that will define global trade geography for the next century. The common thread across all 3 flashpoints is not territorial. It is the psychology of precedent. Each nation is watching to see how the other responds to pressure, because that response will define the boundary of acceptable behavior for every future interaction. Neither side can afford to blink first. The Belt and Road Initiative is China's most ambitious geopolitical project, and it is fundamentally psychological in its design. Launched by Xi Jinping in 2010, it has committed over $1 trillion in infrastructure investment across more than 150 countries. Roads, ports, railways, telecommunications networks. The United States and Western analysts initially dismissed it as economic aid. They were reading the wrong manual. The Belt and Road is not a development program. It is a tributary system for the 21st century, a network of economic relationships that places China at the center and creates political leverage with every loan signed. Sri Lanka's Hambantota port, handed to a Chinese state company on a 99-year lease in 2017 after Sri Lanka could not service its debt, became the defining case study. Pakistan, Kenya, Malaysia, and a dozen other nations have found themselves in structurally similar positions. The United States watched this unfold and finally responded in Taiwan with its own counter-initiative. The Build Back Better World Partnership, the psychological race to define the world order, had moved beyond military hardware into the architecture of economic dependency. Now, let us address the most optimistic counter-argument directly. Scholars like Joseph Nye at Harvard have argued for what he calls cooperative rivalry, the idea that 2 powers can compete fiercely in some domains while cooperating genuinely in others. Climate change is the strongest evidence for this position. In 2021, despite severe deterioration in the overall relationship, American climate envoy John Kerry and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping maintained a surprisingly productive back channel that contributed directly to outcomes at COP26 in Glasgow. The 2 nations together account for roughly 42% of all global carbon emissions. No climate agreement is physically possible without genuine cooperation between them. The COVID-19 pandemic similarly created moments of forced scientific data sharing. These exceptions are real and important. But notice what they have in common. They are both domains where the threat is external. The atmosphere does not care about national identity. They are not evidence that the two nations can cooperate on questions where their identities directly compete. The distinction is not minor. It is the entire argument. The denuclearization of North Korea is the starkest example of how this rivalry defeats even shared interests. Both the United States and China officially agree that a nuclear-armed North Korea is dangerous. Both nations have participated in the same multilateral negotiations, the six-party talks, aimed at solving the problem. They failed, completely. As documented extensively in research on U.S.-China relations, the two countries could not achieve denuclearization because their underlying motivations were incompatible. Washington wanted a denuclearized Korea as a prelude to reduced Chinese influence in the peninsula and potentially Korean reunification under a pro-Western government. Beijing wanted Korean stability as a buffer state against exactly that outcome, a U.S.-aligned unified Korea on its border. The same stated goal, denuclearization, was in service of completely opposite strategic visions. This is the pattern that repeats across every domain of U.S.-China interaction. The surface agreement conceals the subsurface incompatibility, and each time the incompatibility surfaces, it deepens the distrust that makes the next attempt at cooperation slightly less likely to succeed. So, what does this mean for you? For the ordinary person watching this rivalry unfold? 3 things, grounded in what we actually know. First, stop expecting a diplomatic breakthrough to resolve this. Every summit communique, every handshake, every joint statement about a new era of engagement is theater performed for domestic audiences by leaders who understand privately that the structural drivers of this conflict are not responsive to goodwill. Demand more from your politicians than reassuring language. Second, understand the economic consequences that are already underway. The decoupling of U.S. and Chinese supply chains, from semiconductors to pharmaceuticals to rare earth minerals, will restructure global trade for the next 50 years. Every government on Earth is being forced to choose sides. The nations that navigate this most skillfully will be those who understand what is really happening. Not a trade dispute, not a political cycle, but a structural reorganization of the global order. Third, the countries that matter most in the next phase are not the US and China. They are India, the EU, Southeast Asia, and Africa. The swing actors whose alignment choices will determine the shape of the world that emerges from this rivalry. Here is the psychological prescription, not for governments, but for understanding. The single most important intellectual tool you can apply to this rivalry is what negotiation theorists call distinguishing positions from interests. The United States and China have incompatible positions. They cannot both be the world's leading power. They cannot both set the rules of the international system. They cannot both claim universal legitimacy for their models of governance. These positions are genuinely zero-sum, but their underlying interests, security, prosperity, the welfare of their populations, the avoidance of catastrophic war, are not zero-sum. Research in conflict resolution, most notably by Harvard's Roger Fisher and William Ury in their framework from the Program on Negotiation, shows that even the most intractable conflicts can be stabilized when parties focus on interests rather than positions. The question is not, who leads the world order? That question has no peaceful answer. The question that might have a peaceful answer is, what kind of world order allows both nations to be secure and prosperous without either dominating the other? That question has never been seriously asked at the highest levels. Perhaps it should be. The comparison to Athens and Sparta is worth returning to one final time, because how that story ended matters. Sparta won the Peloponnesian War, Athens was defeated, its democracy briefly dismantled, its empire dissolved. And then something remarkable happened. Within a generation, Athens had rebuilt its intellectual and cultural dominance. Spartan military hegemony lasted less than 30 years before collapsing under its own internal contradictions. The victor was exhausted and brittle. The defeated was resilient and regenerating. Great power rivalries, when they end in open conflict, do not produce clean victors. They produce two wounded nations and a world order that neither designed nor wanted. The most sophisticated thinkers in both Washington and Beijing understand this. The question is whether the psychological machinery of collective narcissism, the security dilemma, the fundamental attribution error, and asymmetric payoffs will allow that understanding to influence actual behavior, or whether it will be overwhelmed, as it has been 16 times in history, by the logic of the trap itself. The answer to that question is the most important geopolitical variable of the 21st century. The United States and China are not enemies by choice. They are rivals by psychological architecture. The Thucydides Trap, the security dilemma, collective narcissism, and the fundamental attribution error are not exotic theories. They are the documented, repeatable mechanisms that have driven great power conflict across 5 centuries of history. Understanding them is not pessimism. It is the minimum requirement for changing the outcome. 3 things to carry with you. 1. This rivalry is structural, not personal, and no single leader will resolve it. 2. The most dangerous moments will come not from Maoists, but from miscalculation driven by cognitive bias. 3. The citizens of both nations have more in common in their interests than their governments have in their positions. Now here is the question I want you to answer in the comments. If you had to identify the single decision by one nation in one domain that could most reduce the risk of catastrophic conflict between these two superpowers, what would it be? Subscribe for weekly documentaries that go this deep. The next one goes somewhere even more uncomfortable.